I stood in the marble foyer of the Gold Coast penthouse, the absolute silence ringing in my ears. My husband, Tyler, lay dying in the intensive care unit at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. His mother, Amanda, slid a heavy paper check across the polished mahogany table. $25,000. The memo line was perfectly blank, but the terms were perfectly clear. "Take the money, Ashley," Amanda said, her aristocratic voice steady and devoid of warmth. "Terminate the pregnancy, sign the non-disclosure agreement, and go back to wherever you came from." She didn't look at me with hate. She looked at me like a bad investment she was finally liquidating. I didn't cry. I didn't ask why. I just walked into the guest bathroom, locked the heavy oak door, and stared at my reflection in the gilded mirror. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon panic or despair. But there was only absolute freezing clarity. This wasn't a breakdown. It was a balance sheet. For 3 years, I had been the silent investor in their corrupted version of family. They normalized the cruelty so efficiently, systematically extracting my resources, that I thought my constant emotional deficit was just the required price of admission. That is the fundamental trap of cruel normalization. Toxic people do not ask you to sacrifice once. They structure your relationship as an endless subscription model, where you are perpetually footing the bill for their prestige. Your endurance is considered standard operating procedure, and your boundaries are treated as breaches of contract. I was an elite structural engineer, a heritage restorer. I built foundations meant to withstand earthquakes, yet I had let Amanda and her aristocratic circle treat me like disposable scaffolding. The numbers started scrolling through my mind, precise and unforgiving. $150,000 in unpaid invoices for the structural restoration I personally executed on their commercial properties. I had waived my standard fees because Amanda insisted family took care of family, a clause that apparently only operated in one direction. Then came the $90,000 transferred directly from my personal savings just 6 months ago to cover Zachary's catastrophic margin trading disaster. My money had quietly saved the family's shipping conglomerate from a humiliating public default. I hadn't acted out of blind affection. I had acted out of strict contractual loyalty to my husband. Now I realized my loyalty had been leveraged. Amanda and Zachary weren't shocked by the ultimatum they had issued today. They had simply run the numbers, assessed Tyler's failing health, and decided my unborn child and I were unapproved liabilities to be permanently cut before his heart stopped beating entirely. I turned on the brass faucet, letting the freezing water run over my wrists to ground myself. I didn't need to grieve the loss of a family, because I finally understood I had never actually been part of one. I had been an external vendor, an asset to be completely drained and discarded. I dried my hands with a monogrammed towel. I pulled my laptop from my tote bag and set it on the marble vanity. It was time to initiate a complete, unsparing audit of the shipping conglomerate accounts. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community and if you've ever had to stand up for yourself against someone who thought they were better than you. I left the penthouse at 11:51 p.m. without uttering a single word to Amanda. I didn't take the main visitor entrance when I arrived at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. I bypassed the grand lobby waiting room entirely, utilizing the subterranean service corridors I had memorized when I audited the hospital's structural blueprints for a retrofitting project years ago. I navigated the maze of concrete and fluorescent lights until I found Dr. Seth, the head of the intensive care unit, waiting precisely where we had arranged by the staff elevators. He held a secure medical tablet and met my gaze with grim, professional understanding. Amanda operated under the arrogant assumption that she controlled the narrative because she currently held the medical and financial power of attorney. She had critically underestimated the strict logistics of hospital protocols and my husband's intermittent, yet sharp moments of lucidity. I scrubbed in, my movements mechanical and efficient, and entered Tyler's sterile room. The rhythmic, mechanical hum of the ventilators provided a steady metronome for the transaction that was about to take place. Tyler was awake. He was pale, his vitals visibly fading on the monitors, but his eyes reflected absolute, crystal clear consciousness. We didn't exchange tearful goodbyes. We didn't waste oxygen on romantic apologies or hollow reassurances. This was a tactical execution of legal protocol. He had meticulously prepared these digital trust documents weeks ago, anticipating his mother's desperation. He only needed to trigger the final activation. I set my laptop on his rolling tray table, angled so the camera captured both of us. Dr. Seth stood solemnly beside us, fulfilling his role as the medical witness to confirm Tyler's cognitive clarity at the time of the trust's initial creation. A standard oral will or paper document could be contested in probate court by Amanda's high-priced litigation team for decades. I refused to leave any legal loopholes. Instead, we bypassed the traditional courts entirely. Tyler looked directly into the camera lens, and we initiated a digital trust activation via video verification. Dr. Seth stood solemnly beside us, fulfilling his role as the required, legally binding medical witness to formally verify Tyler's sound mind, cognitive awareness, and completely uncoerced state. The encrypted software recorded Tyler's face. His voice was frail, struggling against the machinery keeping him alive, but his words were legally absolute. I, Tyler, hereby immediately and irrevocably revoke all previous financial and medical powers of attorney currently held by my mother, Amanda. I authorize the immediate, irreversible transfer of all my voting shares, liquid assets, and controlling interests in the shipping conglomerate into the newly established irrevocable trust, managed solely and exclusively by my wife, Ashley. With 3 separate biometric verifications, a retinal scan, and a time-stamped encrypted digital signature, the entire corporate hierarchy of his family's empire was fundamentally and permanently rewritten. The data transfer was instantaneous, verified across secure servers, and entirely unassailable. I watched the confirmation interface flash a solid, definitive green. Amanda's power was officially severed. She was no longer the controlling matriarch. She was effectively a minority shareholder in a corporation I now completely controlled. I leaned down and kissed Tyler's forehead. It wasn't just a gesture of farewell, it was the final sealing of an ironclad pact. He closed his eyes, the tension finally leaving his jaw as his breathing slowed. I didn't break down. I simply closed the laptop with a sharp click. The legal transaction was complete, and the assets were locked. I turned to Dr. Seth, thanked him for his precise clinical cooperation, and walked out of the intensive care unit. The retaliation had been officially initiated. By 12 o'clock midnight, the encrypted files were fully synced to my secure server. I didn't return to the penthouse. Instead, I drove straight to my downtown office, booted up my multi-monitor workstation, and initiated a highly coordinated corporate surgical strike. The new trust documents granted me supreme executive authority, and I intended to weaponize every fraction of it before sunrise. Because I had been the primary engineer overseeing the company's digital security infrastructure upgrades last year, I still held the master administrator backdoor keys. I opened the administrative portal and executed a global freeze on all discretionary corporate accounts. Every black credit card held by Amanda, every limitless expense account linked to Zachary, and every executive petty cash line was terminated with a single, decisive keystroke. The administrative access codes were scrambled, the user passwords reset, and the corporate security protocols upgraded to require my direct biometric approval for any transaction exceeding $100. As I monitored the live ledger, a critical red alert flashed across my secondary screen. Zachary. He was currently logged into the primary operating account from his luxury loft, actively attempting to initiate an expedited wire transfer of $400,000 to an offshore margin trading platform. He was desperately trying to cover another one of his disastrous market bets using the company's monthly payroll funds. I didn't panic. I simply watched the progress bar on his transfer reach 99% before I clicked the administrative override button. The transaction was instantly voided. I watched the system logs as Zachary frantically tried to reinitiate the wire, aggressively inputting his executive credentials over and over, only to be met with a glaring access denied error code. My phone began to vibrate violently on the desk. Zachary's number flashed on the screen. I let it ring until it went to voicemail, then systematically blocked his contact. This was no longer a domestic dispute over a dying man's bedside. This was a hostile corporate takeover and I had just seized the boardroom. I exported the digital logs of his attempted embezzlement, compiling a detailed, incontrovertible dossier of every unauthorized withdrawal he and Amanda had executed over the past 36 months. The spreadsheet grew to thousands of rows, a meticulous, damning record of corporate malfeasance and gross financial negligence. They had mistaken my quiet endurance for ignorance, critically failing to realize that a structural engineer's primary professional skill is identifying load-bearing weaknesses. Their financial infrastructure was completely rotten, built entirely on corporate fraud and unearned entitlement. I forwarded the comprehensive dossier to my corporate attorney Madison with a top priority flag. The parameters of the conflict had irrevocably shifted. We were moving from the messy realm of personal tragedy directly into a formalized, clinical legal war. I poured myself a glass of cold water, my pulse perfectly steady, my mind calculating the next optimal vector of attack. By the time Amanda woke up in her penthouse, she would find her platinum cards declined, her bank access fully revoked, and her golden child son facing a massive, unforgiving margin call he could no longer cover with stolen company funds. I was systematically dismantling the architecture of their privilege, beam by load-bearing beam. At 8 o'clock the next morning, Madison arrived at my office carrying a thick stack of printed financial disclosures. My best friend and corporate property lawyer moved with the lethal efficiency of a predator tracking a wounded asset. She dropped the files onto my desk, her expression perfectly composed, but her eyes gleaming with predatory legal satisfaction. "You aren't just going to freeze their accounts, Ashley," Madison said, tapping the top folder. "You're going to legally evict them by noon." I opened the file. The documents were property deeds and corporate tax filings from the previous fiscal year. I reviewed the ledgers, my mind instantly processing the structural flaw in Amanda's financial architecture. 3 years ago, to avoid paying exorbitant personal property taxes and to shield her assets from potential creditors, Amanda had quietly transferred the deeds of her 2 massive Lake Forest mansions directly into the shipping conglomerate's holding company. She had legally classified her personal residences as corporate assets. It was a classic, arrogant tax evasion trap, built on the assumption that she would always control the corporate entity. She had signed a highly leveraged corporate lease agreement with her own company, essentially renting the mansions from the conglomerate she thought she owned. "Look at the payment history," Madison instructed, tracing a manicured fingernail down the spreadsheet. Amanda hadn't paid her corporate lease in 32 months. She owed the company, my company, over $800,000 in back rent and accrued penalty fees. The lease agreement, drafted by her own arrogant lawyers, contained a standard, unforgiving commercial default clause. If the tenant fell more than 90 days into arrears, the holding company had the absolute legal right to execute an immediate, non-judicial commercial foreclosure and evict the occupants without a standard residential notice period. Because she had misclassified her primary residence as a commercial asset for tax evasion, she had legally waived her rights to long-term residential eviction protections. She was essentially a corporate squatter in a building the company owned. She classified her home as a commercial corporate asset to dodge the IRS, I noted, the cold reality of her mistake crystallizing. And by doing so, she stripped herself of all residential tenant protections. "Exactly," Madison confirmed, her tone purely transactional. "She is currently a commercial tenant in catastrophic default. The trust you activated last night makes you the sole managing director of the holding company. You hold the debt, and you hold the deed." I didn't hesitate. I didn't waste a single second considering the emotional implications of putting my mother-in-law on the street. This was strictly accounting. I authorized Madison to draft the immediate notice of commercial default and the subsequent foreclosure execution. We printed the documents, the printer humming methodically as it generated the instruments of Amanda's total financial ruin. I signed my name on the executive authorization line, my signature sharp and unwavering. I instructed Madison to provide them with a modest relocation stipend, just enough for a basic apartment so that my actions remained strictly professional, not vengeful. We weren't just cutting off their cash supply, we were actively foreclosing on their reality. By transferring her estates into the corporate structure to cheat the government, Amanda had inadvertently handed me the legal mechanism to strip her of her sanctuary. She had built her own trap, locked the door, and handed me the detonator. I stacked the signed foreclosure documents neatly into a leather portfolio. The financial freeze was merely the containment strategy. The eviction was the surgical strike. I looked at Madison, my mind operating with total clinical detachment. "File the foreclosure," I ordered, "and schedule a boardroom meeting for 2 o'clock. It's time to inform the former majority shareholder that her lease has been permanently terminated." The confrontation took place in the glass-walled boardroom of Madison's law firm on Michigan Avenue, high above the city traffic. I sat at the head of the long mahogany table, my posture straight, a stack of heavily audited financial dossiers perfectly aligned in front of me. At exactly 2 o'clock, the heavy glass doors swung open. Amanda stormed in, her designer suit immaculate but her face contorted in unprecedented, frantic rage. Zachary trailed behind her, looking pale and thoroughly defeated, clutching a phone that was undoubtedly receiving automated margin call alerts. Mrs. Vanderhoof, the formidable president of the Elite Heritage Club and Amanda's primary social sponsor, had been invited to attend under the guise of an emergency corporate governance review. She sat observing the scene with a cold, calculating gaze. "What is the meaning of this?" Amanda demanded, slamming her designer handbag onto the table. "My cards are declining. The bank is refusing my calls." "You have no authority to lock me out of my own family's accounts? You arrogant little structural engineer." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't react to the insult. I simply slid the commercial foreclosure notice across the polished wood. "I am not locking you out of your accounts, Amanda," I stated, my tone entirely transactional. "I am locking you out of my company's assets. And as of noon today, I am foreclosing on your Lake Forest properties due to catastrophic commercial default." Amanda stared at the legal document, the color draining rapidly from her aristocratic face. I turned my attention to Mrs. Vanderhoof, handing her a separate, curated folder. "Mrs. Vanderhoof, as an esteemed stakeholder in this city's heritage, I thought you should be fully aware of the financial malfeasance occurring within your social circle." I watched as the club president opened the folder. It contained the meticulous logs of Zachary's attempted embezzlement and Amanda's deliberate tax evasion schemes involving the Lake Forest estates. I didn't need to yell or scream to destroy them. I just needed to let the data speak. The illusion of their superiority dissolved in seconds. There is a profound psychological phenomenon regarding the illusory power of the empty wallet. Wealthy socialites often mistake the superficial trappings of money, the designer clothes, the exclusive club memberships, the sprawling estates for actual inherent personal value. They believe their bank accounts grant them immunity from basic human decency and legal accountability. But when that financial leverage is surgically removed, when the accounts are frozen and the deeds are foreclosed upon, the illusion instantly shatters. Without their money to shield them, they are reduced to their core components, and Amanda's core was completely bankrupt. Her social power was entirely theoretical, a lease agreement she could no longer afford to maintain. Mrs. Vanderhoof closed the folder with a sharp, disgusted snap. She didn't look at Amanda with pity. She looked at her with total social revulsion. "Tax fraud and corporate embezzlement, Mrs." Vanderhoof said, her voice dripping with absolute disdain. "You are a disgrace to this city, Amanda. Consider your club membership permanently revoked." Without another word, Mrs. Vanderhoof stood up and walked out of the boardroom, severing Amanda's last remaining lifeline to high society. Amanda collapsed into a leather chair, her hands shaking, her false empire entirely dismantled by a woman she thought she could easily discard. They weren't shocked by what they'd done. They were shocked that I'd finally stopped playing along. The eviction was executed with the same precise, unemotional efficiency as the corporate freeze. 2 days after the boardroom confrontation, a court-appointed civil enforcement officer arrived at the wrought iron gates of the Lake Forest mansions. I didn't go to watch the spectacle. I didn't require the petty, dramatic satisfaction of seeing Amanda and Zachary physically escorted off the premises, forced to carry whatever personal belongings they could fit into standard-issue cardboard boxes. I was sitting at my drafting desk, methodically reviewing structural blueprints for a new commercial high-rise, when Madison texted me the secure confirmation code. The properties were legally secured, the locks physically drilled and replaced. and the complex perimeter alarm systems reset under my exclusive master code. The toxic, bloated infrastructure of their lives had been completely condemned and legally demolished. My mind remained a quiet, orderly balance sheet. I simply archived the text message, took a sip of black coffee, and returned my focus to my architectural drafting. 1 year later, the shipping conglomerate was fundamentally unrecognizable. I had aggressively liquidated the underperforming international subsidiaries, cleared Zachary's staggering margin debts through calculated asset forfeiture, and ruthlessly restructured the core business model to focus exclusively on sustainable domestic logistics. The company was highly profitable, remarkably lean, and entirely under my absolute unchallengeable control. Concurrently, my own structural engineering firm had expanded at an unprecedented rate, securing massive municipal contracts to restore the city's historical architecture, ensuring that the city's true foundations were preserved. I had taken the smoldering ashes of a deeply corrupted family empire and engineered a thriving, fiercely resilient foundation in its exact place. Tyler had passed away quietly 2 days after the digital trust transfer. I arranged a dignified, efficient funeral service, paid all the outstanding medical debts from the corporate holding accounts, and closed his estate with absolute clinical precision. 6 months after his passing, I gave birth to a perfectly healthy baby girl. She is the sole heir to everything I have built, and she will never know the toxic conditional love of the Vanderhoof family. I heard through Madison's extensive legal network that Amanda and Zachary were currently renting a cramped, deteriorating 2-bedroom apartment in a significantly less desirable industrial suburb. Zachary had been forced to take a minimum wage job in retail logistics, ironically, moving boxes for a competitor to satisfy his remaining personal creditors. Amanda spent her days unsuccessfully trying to petition former social acquaintances who universally refused to return her calls, her name entirely blacklisted from the city's elite heritage clubs. I didn't feel pity, and I certainly didn't feel triumph. I just felt the quiet, steady equilibrium of a complex ledger that had finally been balanced to zero. To anyone listening who has ever felt like a permanent outsider in their own life, who has been treated as a utility rather than a human being, I deeply need you to understand the fundamental architecture of your own worth. Far too often, we stay in deeply toxic environments, whether it is a highly manipulative family, an abusive relationship, or an exploitative corporate structure, because we erroneously believe our endless endurance will eventually earn us a legitimate seat at their table. We mistakenly view our vast capacity to absorb their cruelty as a badge of honor, a silent emotional investment that will one day pay massive dividends in the form of actual love or genuine respect. But the harsh mathematical truth is that the people who force you to live perpetually on the fringes of their affection will never, ever promote you to the center of their lives. They rely heavily on your perpetual hope to fund their continual extraction of your resources. You are not required to be the structural support column for someone else's engineered dysfunction. You have the absolute, undeniable right to audit the relationships in your life, to identify the massive, draining emotional liabilities, and to execute a total, unapologetic foreclosure on anyone who treats your personal boundaries as an open negotiation. The power they hold over you is entirely illusory, heavily dependent on your continued willingness to play by their corrupted, rigged rules. The exact moment you stop seeking their toxic validation, their entire empire collapses, revealing the empty, bankrupt reality of their control. You do not need to burn their house down. You simply need to formally evict them from yours. If this story gave you the strength to set your own boundaries, or reminded you that your worth isn't defined by people who don't value you, please share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Don't forget to subscribe to help us keep exposing these stories and decoding the psychology behind true justice. I've come to realize that genuine closure is not something you passively receive from the people who fundamentally injured you. It is a solid, unyielding structure you must intentionally build for yourself. Brick be heavy brick. For a very long time, I waited in the dark for an apology that was never going to materialize, carrying the suffocating weight of their entitlement like a massive debt I owed the universe. But forgiveness isn't always for the other person. And it doesn't always look like a warm embrace or a tearful reconciliation. Sometimes, forgiveness is just the quiet, profound act of permanently closing the ledger. It is the deep, healing realization that their inherent brokenness is no longer your project to fix or manage. I look at my life now, the quiet, undisturbed mornings, the steady, fulfilling rhythm of a career I deeply love, the absolute, undeniable safety of a home where absolutely no one demands a toll for my existence, and I feel a profound, overwhelming sense of peace. The storm didn't destroy me. It merely cleared the toxic ground so I could finally build a beautiful, lasting foundation that was truly, undeniably my own.